first initiative on the ballot is an initiative to the people. It is one that received the required number of signatures on a petition to place it directly on the November ballot. Initiative 1351 is the measure we have to consider. This initiative concerns K-12 education. It would direct the legislature to allocate funds to reduce class sizes and increase staffing support for students in all K-12 grades, with additional class size reductions and staffing increases in high poverty schools. We have two speakers on this issue. Mary Howes is part of the Yes on 1351 campaign and represents class size counts. There's no organized campaign opposing Initiative 1351. However, Chris Cargill from the Eastern Washington Director for the Washington Policy Center will present the center's views. So we begin with opening statements of 1.5 minutes from each of our speakers. Pro is Ms. Howes.
Thank you. I am Mary Howes. I am the mother of 4 boys who are in Washington Public Schools. I'm a former Washington State teacher, and I am the proud sponsor of Initiative 1351, which reduced class sizes in all Washington schools, grades K through 12. Right now, Washington ranks 47th out of 50 states in class size. That means that Washington kids are in some of the most crowded classrooms in the nation. What this initiative does is it reduces class sizes in grades K through 3 to an average of 17 students, and in grades 4 through 12 to an average of 25 students. And that takes us from being 47th in the nation to just about average, or roughly about 26th in the nation in class size. So this initiative is simply about getting our students out of some of the most crowded classrooms and into a place where they're on par with the rest of the nation. These class size recommendations come from the state. The state had a bipartisan committee that made recommendations for staffing schools, and we simply have took what the state said that they should do and what they would do, and this initiative just puts those staffing recommendations into law. I have had the opportunity to hear from thousands of parents across the state, and this initiative has strong support from parents, from educators, from community leaders, from PTA leaders, superintendents, all kinds of people across the state. So I hope you'll join me in voting yes on Initiative 1351.
Okay, and now we'll go to you, Mr. Cargill, 1.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to the League of Women Voters, to Mary as well for being here, for everyone in the audience, for those of you watching at home. This is a very sensitive topic. It's something that we're all very concerned about, something we want to make sure that we're doing right by our students that are in our public schools. I, like Mary, am a father of 2, have 2 boys. I don't have 4. Sometimes it seems like I have 4, but I don't. But I want to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can as well. And so we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We're doing what's going to have the most amount of impact. And so we've taken a look at this issue at Washington Policy Center and taken a look at how other states have done this, how other countries have done this, and really think about it. When the school year starts and you take your child to your school to find out what teacher they have, or to find out which classroom that they're in, the eagerness and the anticipation is for the teacher. You're not trying to find out how many students are in the classroom. You're trying to find out which teacher did Johnny get. Did he get Mrs. Smith? Did he get Mrs. Johnson? Because you know from talking to your neighbors, talking in the community, which teachers are best. Washington State has an important duty. Obviously, it's a paramount duty of the state to make sure that we are fully educating each and every child. We want to make sure that the policies we're adopting with our limited resources that we have are the most effective policies. And we have seen other states do this type of thing in the past, and Washington State is on this path right now, and we'll talk more about that throughout the forum.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to move into some questions, and we'll go back and forth. Starting with you on this one, Mr. Cargill. Would you both please speak to any research that's out there that indicates or not the benefit/need for smaller class sizes?
That's a great question. So there are think tanks, there are groups all across the country that have taken a look at class size reduction. You have the Center for American Progress, which is a left-leaning think tank. You have The Hoover Institute at Stanford University has taken a look at this. In fact, the Hoover Institute took a close look at all class size studies, almost 300 of them, all across the country, and determined that in 85% of those situations, it had no impact whatsoever on a child's ability to learn or the outcomes in the classroom. And in a small number of cases, it actually had a detrimental impact. And the reason why we saw in California in the late 1990s, California embarked on this process, as did Florida and a few other states. And as a result, the state of California forced school districts to hire so many more teachers that many of those teachers were ineffective teachers. So instead of a child being in a classroom with 25 students and a very effective teacher, that child was in a classroom with 20 students and an ineffective teacher.
Okay, Ms. House.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between really good scientific research and the work of think tanks or different, policy groups. And so there has been some very good, strong research where they did compare students in a crowded classroom versus in a smaller classroom and followed those students' progress for years and found that the benefits lasted throughout their entire education. And there's, there are quite a few studies that we could go into, but I like to avoid the research debate a little bit because to me, while there's great research, there's also just common sense. And we know it doesn't make sense to have 30 kindergarten students with one teacher in a classroom when they're trying to learn basic skills. And it doesn't make sense to have 35 or in some cases 40 kids in a science lab that's designed for 25. So again, we can talk about research, but I think it's also important to listen to parents and students and hear their stories of what they're experiencing right now and why that's not right for kids.
All right, so we have information and feelings about actual class size, and of course the other side is the fiscal impact. The fiscal impact statement in the voters' pamphlet states that the initiative will not increase or decrease state revenues, but that state expenditures will increase. And so hopefully basic math is letting people know that we have something to deal with here in terms of the money. The state budget is already an issue. How do you see a resolution here? And you'll each have a minute to answer this. We'll start with you, Ms. Howes.
Right. So the state already needs to do this. The state already needs to fully fund education to comply with the Supreme Court order by 2018. As part of the state's defense during the Supreme Court hearing, they said, we have a plan for funding education, and one piece of that plan was the recommendations for class size that are in this initiative. We did not create these recommendations. We simply took them from the state's own bipartisan council and put them into the initiative. So all this initiative does is it says that when the state complies and fully funds education, make sure that they include their own staffing recommendations and reduce class sizes, because that's really where students feel the lack of funding and parents feel the lack of funding, because the kids deserve that more attention that they need to learn and succeed in classrooms.
Okay, Mr. Cargill.
Look, we're already embarking on this effort right now as a state. As a state, our average class sizes are 24 in elementary and 28 in the junior and senior high schools. Now, in some areas that may be higher, some areas that may be lower. That's an average around the state. In the last legislative session, the legislature put an extra $120 million into class size reduction and actually took a look specifically at high poverty schools and made the target that we're going to have no more than 20 students per classroom in high poverty schools. So we're already doing this. And as you pointed out, the McCleary decision and education funding right now is a very important topic. If you look at almost all of the newspapers across the state are coming out in opposition to this initiative, calling it, and I'm quoting from the Wenatchee World right now, a budget bomb near obliteration in scope. It will add about $5 billion onto the state's budget obligations coming up in the next few years. And a very important point, there is no funding mechanism in this. So the legislature will have to figure out how to fund it.
And that is a point. This initiative did not have a funding mechanism, so let's just pursue this a little bit more, kind of in terms of like a rebuttal. So we'll go back to Ms. Howes and have a little bit discussion on, where do you see the money coming from?
This is something the state already needs to do. They need to fully and amply fund education. That's what the Supreme Court order states. I think what concerns me as a parent is that people are misconstruing what full funding means. They seem to think that we can do just a little bit and that will count for full funding. There's a lot of pieces to fully funding education. Class size is merely part of it, but it's an important part. So again, all this initiative does is ask them to do what they need to do, but to make sure they include class size in the full funding. The McCleary decision doesn't have a list of items that they can do and then other ones that are optional and then class sizes over here. It simply says that the state has failed to fully fund education, and surely we would not be 47th in the nation in class size if the state were meeting its obligation and fully funding our schools.
Just let me quickly address the 47th in the nation. That is an outdated number. If you take a look at many other states have higher students to teacher ratios. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that is an accurate statistic. How are we going to pay for it is a very valid question. Again, I would like to see, as a parent as well, I would like to see teachers be given this much flexibility if we can find a way, A, to pay for it, and B, to show that it would actually work. But we did this exercise back in 2002 and 2003 with Initiative 728 and 732. We put this classroom reduction measure on the ballot without funding. It was approved because everybody looks at that and says, geez, this is something we would like to be able to do. And then when voters were asked to pay for it via an income tax in 2010, it was solidly rejected. And as a result, the legislature suspended it. So I fear that that's the direction we're going in this case as well, that this may very well pass, but when it gets to the legislative session, they may say, we don't have the money to pay for it because there's no funding in it.
Okay, so let's go back and pull in the McCleary decision a little bit more, because as you both alluded to, the McCleary decision and with the legislature, with the courts, have a whole lot of issues that are already there. How do you see this initiative interfacing with that, impacting it one way or the other? And you'll have a minute on this. We'll start with Mr. Cargill.
Yeah, it's tough to know. What it will definitely do is make the legislature's decisions much harder. What we're suggesting at Washington Policy Center is that if this does indeed pass, that the legislature go back to a priorities of government approach, which means that we follow the Supreme Court order. Education should be our number one priority. It's a paramount duty of the state. It's in the Constitution. But at the same time, this initiative does not have any funding in it. So how do you go about funding it? Well, we could go back to voters if we would like next year and ask voters to put in place a state income tax if they really think that this is important. We could ask voters to increase the state sales tax by 2 or 3%. We could ask voters to raise taxes on businesses all across the state. Eventually, you have to figure out a way to pay for it. And this is on top of any discussion that we are having on the McCleary case. And the McCleary estimates are anywhere from $3 to $5 billion to fully fund basic education to the Supreme Court's order. So you take $3 to $5 billion for McCleary. This initiative is estimated to cost about $5 billion between now and 2019. That's about a $10 billion hole that somehow we're going to have to fill if it passes.
Okay, Ms. Howes, we'll give you a little bit more time to respond on that.
Thanks. So again, I think it's a bit misleading to suggest that there is an exact price tag on what it will take to comply with the Supreme Court order. That's for the Supreme Court to decide. The state was found to not be fully funding schools, and they will need to show that they are, and the Supreme Court will decide whether or not they are. So I get frustrated with numbers that are thrown around about what it will cost, because we don't know what the Supreme Court will say equals full funding. But I think, again, it comes down to common sense that fully funding our schools would address the horrible class size situation that's in our state, as well as other pieces of education. This is not to the exclusion of other things, but it concerns me to continue to hear people try to talk about what's the minimum we can do? I mean, it reminds me of one of my sons who, when he has a really big project, and he kind of tends to procrastinate. And then as the deadline gets closer and closer, instead of buckling down, what he does is he starts to figure out, well, what's the least amount I can do? And, really, this assignment's kind of stupid. In fact, I don't think I need to include these parts or that parts. And that's what I'm hearing, and that's why I feel like this initiative is so necessary, is that we're hearing from lawmakers and we're hearing from the state that it just doesn't seem like they're going to take this seriously. And this is a serious problem that needs an answer.
Okay, I'm going to roll back and see if either one of you have a little bit more you want to rebut or add to this.
Sure, yeah.
Cargill, 30 seconds.
Yeah, there's a couple of very important points to make, what I like to call the 4 W's of this initiative. First, it's without funding. We've already talked about that. It's without guarantees. We have no guarantees that this money is actually going to, if it were to be approved, and if the legislature were actually to fund the measure, that this money would actually result in class size reduction. We took a look at the numbers and determined that Initiative 1351 would require school districts to create 25,561 new staffing positions. The majority of those staffing positions would be outside of the classroom. In fact, 71% would be outside of the classroom. 29% would be actual teachers. There's no guarantees that we're actually going to see an increase in the number of teachers if this initiative were to pass. And the one other important point is that this is going to result in the Washington Education Association getting about $7 million a year extra in union dues as a result. And so you can see why they would be so much in favor of it and have put $350,000 into this campaign.
Okay, we'll give Ms. Hauser the same amount of time Mr. Cargill took there.
Thank you. So, first of all, I think that, again, those numbers are misleading. This initiative, probably over the 4 years, would provide for about 15,000 more teachers. A lot of these recommendations come from the state, so it does include other staffing positions for schools, but there are positions that I think most people, and certainly students and parents, would see as educators. So people like teacher librarians, counselors, instructional aides are all part of this, so that we make sure, again, the goal of this initiative is to get more qualified caring adults working with fewer students so students can have the success that they need and deserve. I think that we've addressed the funding issue. The state will fund it. The state needs to fund education. So I think it would be misleading to try to separate that from full funding. It's absolutely part of what the state needs to do to fully fund our schools. And I just have to say that, as a parent and one of the, I think we had easily 10,000 volunteers gather over 325,000 signatures in an all-volunteer effort. This is certainly not about increasing union dues for the Washington Education Association. It's about trying to do something for kids who continue to sit and suffer while we argue about money.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, and just so that voters know, once they get their voters pamphlet and the statement on the initiative, there are lots of tables in there that show just exactly what some of those staffing increases would be. But are there other increases that would be included other than just staffing?
This initiative simply deals with staffing. So it takes the state's bipartisan QEC recommendations and puts them into law. And so what the state did is they looked at what does it take to staff a prototypical school? How many teachers do you need? How many counselors do you need? And so forth. And it made their recommendations. And it used those recommendations as part of their defense during the Supreme Court hearing, but they simply never acted on it. So this simply deals with that. You will hear some people add in other costs that simply are not in this initiative. This initiative does not require you to build more buildings. It funds the staff. It does not require, I'm trying to think of some of the other things that Chris was mentioning, but it really just provides the funding for staff so that they can work with students and that we get those staff working with students as soon as possible.
Okay, Mr. Cargill.
Well, a couple of different things we could talk about. If we're going to hire 10 to 15,000 more teachers, where are we going to put them? That's an important thing that we have to discuss. And so if this initiative were to pass, I just want to point out that it does give local school districts the authority to increase the amount of revenue they have coming in for the purposes of building new facilities so that they can house these new teachers in new classrooms. That's the first point. Second point is that we talked about the numbers. These numbers come from the state. They're not coming from Washington Policy Center. They're coming from the state estimates. And the non-teaching position number of additional staff would be about 17,081, 1,027 additional administrators, and then the number of teachers would be about 7,500. So it's important to figure out exactly where all these funding sources are going if we're going to actually fund this initiative were it to pass, and how many teachers we're actually going to be hired if we actually find a way to fund this initiative were it to pass.
Can I clarify something on those
Certainly.
numbers? Sure. I just want to be clear that the report you're referring to subtracts out all kindergarten through third grade teachers because the state says they're going to address that, which is great. I hope they do, but they haven't done it yet. So this initiative includes those teachers. So when you get that 7,000, it's a misrepresentation because it doesn't include the staff, the teachers for grades K through 3. The other piece that's really important to remember is these other positions, again, are things like teacher librarians, counselors, instructional aides, and they're not positions that don't work with students. And again, they come from the state. So I just want to clarify those numbers.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Mr. Cargill?
In the 1970s, we had 43 teachers for every 1,000 students. Today, that number is 54 teachers for every 1,000 students. And as I said earlier, in the last legislative session, the legislature put $120 million more into class size reduction to try to limit class sizes specifically in those high-poverty schools. So this is something that we're already doing. The question is, do we take another step, an unfunded step, and try to do something even more without having the knowledge of where that funding is going to come from, and by making the job for our legislators a lot more difficult in the next legislative session.
Okay, Mr. Cargill, you started talking about the 4 Ws. I don't think we got through the whole list.
Yeah, I think we missed
I'd like you to
the
finish
W.
the list, and then
Yeah.
I'd like Ms. Howes to be able to comment on.
Well-
So you said without funding, without guarantees, what would be?
Yeah, the third one is without an improvement in student learning. Again, if you go back and look at the research that has been done as a result of this, and this comes from Stanford. This does not come from any think tank across the country. It comes from Stanford University. They have determined that there is no measurable impact in 85% of the cases. Now, there may be a measurable impact in some, and there may be an undesirable impact in others, but in the vast majority of them, there is no impact. So that was the third. And then the fourth W was the windfall profit for the Washington Education Association. They're the #1 funder of this initiative. They're the ones putting all the money into this initiative, and they're the ones who will see all that money paid back and then some were it to pass.
Okay, so you've heard those 5 Ws he has.
The 4 Ws.
Oh, 4 Ws, you're right. See, my basic math is. So the 4 Ws, and so respond to those, if you would, please.
Well, I think I've addressed at least a couple of those. I think we would probably bore your viewers if we went back and forth with, well, I can point to this research and he can point to this research. But there's great research, and the research in the end shows that the benefits are there, and there's long-term economic benefits. People are focused on the cost today, but economists will tell you that students that are in lower class sizes have higher rates of graduation, tend to go to college, tend to earn higher incomes, have lower rates of incarceration. So there's a long-term benefit to addressing this issue. And again, the bottom line is, to me, as a parent and a former teacher, it's really common sense. And I just think that being in our classrooms, it does not make sense to keep telling kids and parents that this doesn't matter. They know it matters.
Okay, so now we're going to go to your closing statements. You'll each have 30 seconds, and we're going to start with you, Ms. Howes.
Right. So again, I think that this initiative is really simple. It basically just says that all students, regardless of where they live, the color of their skin, their economic background, or the language they speak, that they deserve to learn and succeed in an uncrowded classroom. Right now, we are failing them by being 47th in the nation. This problem will not get better unless we are serious about doing something. And so I urge everyone to vote yes on Initiative 1351.
Thank you. Mr. Cargill, 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. As a parent as well, a public school child, I want to make sure we're doing what's best as well. And when you look at the numbers that we have in the state right now, I don't think a lot of people realize that 47% of our entire K through 12 establishment and our entire K through 12 population in terms of employees are teachers. 53% are outside of the classroom. Imagine what we could do if we flipped those numbers. If we said we're going to make 53% teachers, 47% outside of the classroom, we could go a long way.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cargill, and thank you to our speakers, pro and con speakers on Initiative 1351. They were Ms. Mary Howes from the Class Size Count and Mr. Cargill from the Washington Policy Center. So thank you very much.